So the topic for today is industrialization. Industrialization in India. So first we'll try to look at the history of industrialization. So if we look at the history of industrialization, we will see that the first industries were the first in 1818. The first coal mining had started by 1818. Then by 1834, remember in the 1813 Act, all monopolies of the company were denied. The company was denied of all monopoly except the tea monopoly. So by 1834, tea plantations had started in Assam. Tea plantations had started. Then by 1854, we had our railways, we had our cotton. By 1854, we had our cotton. The first cotton mill was set up in Bombay. In 1855, we had our first jute mill in Rishra in West Bengal. First jute mill. Railways had also started in 1853. The first railways ran between Mumbai and Thane. Next we come to the World War. Then the Swadeshi movement of 1905 gave a major boost to the textile industry and other indigenous industries in India. In 1911, the first iron and steel company was set up by J.R.D. Tata. And so on. So this is how industrialization progressed in India. Now we will come to the first industrialization in India post independence. Now soon after independence, we had our first industrial policy resolution of 1948. The first industrial resolution of 1948. Now, what did the first industrial resolution of 1948 say? India had adopted a mixed economy model. So, the first industrial resolution of 1948 had the following things. It said that there would be industries in India would be broadly divided into 4 categories. First, those on which the government would have exclusive monopoly, like the manufacture of arms and ammunition, atomic energy, railways, etc. These were exclusive monopoly of the central government. Second, we have monopoly over new units. Then it was decided whatever new units would be set up, like coal, iron and steel, shipbuilding, telephone, telegraph, mineral oils, these new undertakings would be taken over by the state. Then you have the regulated sector, which had sectors like rubber, cement, paper, chemicals, fertilizers, machine, tools, newsprint, automobiles, electrical engineering, etc. And after that, we have certain unregulated private enterprises. This was the only place in the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 where private sector as well as the cooperative sector was allowed. Why was such kind of a... So majority of the sector was reserved for the government. And why was it so? This was because we had adopted a mixed economy model. We wanted a combination of public and private, but since the Indian economy was just taking off, we were in the pre-takeoff stage, or we were in a very nascent stage. So there was lack of capital. Until there is basic infrastructure provided by the government, then the private sector would be reluctant to invest. So the major initiatives were taken by the government. So the main thrust of the industrial policy was a mixed economy model. was on the public sector. Next, we move on to the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956. So this was also based on the mixed economy model and on a socialist pattern of the society. Remember, in the 1954 Congress, the Avadi session, we had taken the socialist resolution. So the industrial policy resolution of 1956 classified industrial sector into 3 schedules. First was Schedule 1. So there were 17 industries which were taken into Schedule A, and these were the exclusive responsibility of the state. For example, iron and steel, atomic energy, heavy castings, heavy plant, etc. Category B were those industries where in Category B 12 industries were included, which were progressively owned progressively owned by the state, and the private sector would only just like Schedule A industries were exclusively under the control of the government, Schedule B industries, their private sector could coexist, but only as a supplement to the efforts of the state. So mostly these were in the hands of the state. It was state owned with limited private sector participation. Here private sector participation was complete no in the sector Schedule A industries. In Schedule B it was only limited. Schedule C was those industries where we totally allowed the private sector. So these Schedule C totally had the private sector. So the responsibility with regard to establishment, functioning and development was entirely in the hands of the private sector. Apart from that, another sector which was the India's traditional sector, that is our handicrafts, our small scale industries, cottage industries, this sector was promoted. So this industrial resolution of 1956, it said that it would give special incentives like tax benefit, like subsidy and technical assistance to these small scale industries. However, the government failed to integrate these industries, and these industries could not provide the necessary or the amount of output, the amount of productivity that was expected from this sector was it did not keep up to our expectations. It had low productivity. Now this, according to the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, foreign capital participation was allowed, but the majority shareholding would be in hands of Indians. And gradually whatever technology would be already existing, now there were certain foreign establishments that were already existing, they would be taken over by the Indian technicians gradually. As a result, there were certain private sector companies which were previously in the hands of foreigners, which were gradually taken over by the Indian government. Now we have something called the MRTP Act. This act is a precursor to the Competition Act of 2002. So what was the main aim of this MRTP Act? This MRTP Act wanted to restrict monopoly and restrictive trade practices except by the government. That is, except the government, no private player could enjoy monopoly in the Indian economy. And the aim of this act was to restrict the concentration of economic power or restrict such monopolistic tendencies in the Indian economy, and to protect the interest of the consumers. Now this act came into power in June 1970. However, there were certain amendments in 1980s, and an MRTP commission was also set up. Now we have another industrial policy resolution. In 1977, the Janata Party came to power, and we have another industrial policy resolution of 1977. According to this industrial policy resolution, for the first time, the small scale sector was divided into 3 stages: the cottage and household industry, the tiny sector, and the small scale industries. Cottage industries, which provides self-employment on a wide scale. Then you have the tiny sector. Cottage industries were industries like mainly related to embroidery and other like beedi making, all these industries were cottage industries, which are mainly concentrated in the household. Uh, then there were tiny sector. Now the classification was up to 1 lakh, investment up to 1 lakh in towns and 50,000 with a population of less than 50,000. So industries located in towns with a population of less than 50,000 and those industries had to have investment up to 1 lakh were classified as the tiny sector. Now we have the small scale industries. The small scale industries would encourage investment up to rupees 10 lakh, and in case of ancillaries there would be an investment in ancillary means the component units of an industry. There would be an investment in fixed capital up to 15 lakhs. Apart from this, now according in this industrial policy resolution, the number of items reserved for the small scale industry was also increased, that is from 105 to 807, and district industrial centers were established in every district. So these district industrial centers were very crucial for the development of these small scale industry. And this district industrial agency would serve as a single roof, like a single window for all kinds of services and support to these small rural entrepreneurs. And the KVIC, that is the Khadi and Village Industries Commission, this was revamped. Now, according to this policy resolution, large industries were categorized into basic and core industry, capital goods industry, high-tech industry, and other industries. So summing up, what are the things that the industrial policy resolution of 1977 do? So what it did was, first it categorized industries into 3 categories. First was cottage industry, which was mainly based on self-employment. Second was tiny industries, which had investment up to 1 lakh. And then you have the small scale industries, which had investment between 10 to 15 lakhs. 15 lakhs with ancillary. And according to this, district industrial centers were set, which became the single window for providing all kinds of support and service to these small rural entrepreneurs. Apart from that, this resolution categorized large industries on the basis of core industry, capital goods industry, high technology industry, and other industries. So basic and core industry, so these were the 4 categories: core industry, capital, high tech, and other industries. So this was the IPR 1948 categorized the 4 categories of industries. First was which was exclusively under the control of the central government. Second was industries were which was under limited control, which would eventually which was under the limited control of the state government, which was exclusive monopoly. Now the new units which would come up, which would be under the monopoly of the government. Then there were sectors which were regulated, so the new units. Then sectors that would be regulated, though their private participation would be there, but they would be regulated. And the last sector was totally under privatization. This was all about the industrial policy resolution of 1948. Now we come to IPR 1956. According to 1956, there were 3 categories of industries. First was those 17 industries which was exclusively under the control. Then there were 12 industries exclusive government control. Then there were these were category A. Then there were the category B industries, which were where the state would be the primary. state would play the primary role. However, private participation was allowed, but they would only have a supplementary role. Would only have a supplementary role. And see which were these where private sector was totally allowed. Where private sector was totally allowed. And apart from that, we also have a small scale sector, small scale industries. Okay. Then you have the IPR of 1977. So this increased the number of industries in the small scale sector. Also, it gave a categorization or a characteristic a categorization of these industries into tiny cottage industries, tiny and small scale industries based on their investment. And you also have the district industrial centers. Apart from that, we also divide industries into core, capital, high tech and other industries. So this also categorized it into core, capital, high tech and others. It also categorized into SSI categorization, district industrial centers, and this was and it also made all possible efforts in the direction of development of indigenous technology. The Janata Party was in government, so more emphasis was given on indigenous development of indigenous technology. For high priority areas were identified where Indian skill and technology were not still developed, and foreign investment was encouraged only for some industries. So this clearly meant that in areas where foreign collaboration was such case would not be reviewed, and that's why we had the FERA Act, Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, that was passed in 1979 probably. So the foreign investment were encouraged only in limited industries. Now you have again the Congress government comes back in 1980, and there were certain changes that were made. The number of industries which were reserved for small scale were decreased, and many units were operating on excess capacity than allowed by law. So these excess capacities were reduced and they were brought under regular capacity, and foreign investment along with technology transfer was allowed. So regulation, licensing restrictions were eased. So they were moving towards easing of licenses. Now the 1991 industrial policy saw a sea change. India was going through, due to the crash of the Soviet and worldwide there was a turmoil. India also ran into a severe foreign exchange crisis. Then according to the structural plan of the IMF, India could come out and it had to pave way for industrialization. It had to pave way for industrialization it had to pave way for liberalization because it had said yes to the structural adjustment plan of the IMF. So we had to change our strategy. We had to change our planning from imperative to indicative planning. And there was a sea change in the industrial policy. So slowly we moved towards privatization. We started delicensing and easing of control and regulation over our industries. Now this was a new era. Now all kinds of industrial licensing were abolished except for 18 industries which were related to strong strategic or security reasons or hazardous chemicals, etc. Or things like cigarette, etc., alcohol, which were things of elitist consumption. Now out of these 18 industries, 13 categories have been removed gradually from the list, and now only 5 categories of industries require licensing. What are those 5 categories? Electronics, aerospace, hazardous chemicals, alcohol, cigarettes, and all types of defense equipment. Now on public sector, the number of industries on which the state had monopoly, they were reduced to 3. There were 8 previously. There were 17 industries according to IPR 1956. 1991 IPR reduced it to 8, and now we only have 3. That is atomic mining, atomic energy, and rail transport. And also the BIFR was set up. Now the BIFR has been abolished, but the Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction was set up, which would look after the SIC units. Those PSUs which were running on loss, those would be taken up. Their cases would be taken up, and accordingly their privatization or disinvestment or merger, whatever would be the decision, in the interest of the workers, etc., everything would be looked after by this board. Name of the board was Board for Industrial and Financial Reconstruction. Now, policy of privatization. Disinvestment. Now, the government took the policy of privatization and disinvestment. The difference between privatization and disinvestment is disinvestment is just selling of shares in the market to the public by the government. Say there's a PSU, so selling of shares to the public, strategic selling of shares to the public in order to gain income or gain proceeds. So in order to gain proceeds from that process. However, the majority stakeholding still remains. So operation management, operational control and management, all this still remains with the government in case of disinvestment. But in case of privatization, this is not the scenario. In case of privatization, the government transfers 51% stake to the private sector, to any private individual or a company or a group. So in this case, the management and operational functions goes to that company. So the government took the policy of disinvestment and privatization in the IPR of 1991. So government announced its intention to offer a part of shareholding in public sector enterprises to mutual funds, financial institutions. This was disinvestment. So now the other important change was the MRTP practice limit. Now under the MRTP Act was enacted, which came into force in 1970. There were certain restrictions that were put on this MRTP Act. So all firms with asset size of 100 crore since 1985 were classified as MRTP firm, and they were permitted to enter select industries only, and this also on a case-by-case basis. So those industries which had asset size of 100 crore and above since 1985, they could enter a particular industry. For example, if Tata had a total asset size of 100 crore, and Tata wants to invest in in automobile sector, in the FMCG sector, and also say in telecom sector. So only on case by case basis, Tata could only enter on a selected industries. That also the government would look at its proposals on a case by case basis, and only then it would grant license. So in that way, the monopoly. So if Tata is a big company, if it enters into say the FMCG market back then, if it had entered, then it would have it would have taken a bulk share or a large market share, and that would reduce the share, and that would have also driven out some sectors out of the economy. So in order to stop that, the MRTP Act was there were certain changes that were made in the MRTP Act. So the strict way monopoly was strictly prohibited in the MRTP Act of 1970. Here some room was made for companies, for big companies, but there were some restrictions. So it was liberalization, or it was some kind of restricted entry. From totally prohibited entry, there was some kind of restricted entry. And in addition to control through industrial licensing, separate approvals were required. So separate approvals were required by these large firms for any investment proposal. So the new industrial policy removed the threshold limit in assets in respect of MRTP companies. So this was what the MRTP company had before. I'm sorry, it had before. But the new industrial policy removed this threshold limit on assets. So this threshold limit, that if you're a big company, then you have to have case by case license, etc. This thing was removed. Now, policy on foreign investment in technology. It prepared a list of high technology and high investment priority industries wherein automatic permission would be given for up to 51% foreign equity. So there were certain high technology industries where up to 51% foreign equity would be allowed. So a number of capital goods, metallurgical industries, entertainment, food processing, service sector, all these sectors which had great export potential, for example, entertainment, electronics, food processing, metallurgical industries, capital goods, in these high profitable, where it had great export potential, the foreign investment up to 51% of equity was allowed. Now, now all these phase manufacturing programs which aimed at indigenization of technology, they were in force. A number of use of indigenous technology was in force in a number of industries, in a number of engineering and electronic sectors. The new industrial policy totally abolished these. So these were the achievements of the new industrial policy of 1991. Thank you.